You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics. National speaker Timmerie Millington has been a passionate advocate for life as long as she can remember, helping Gen X through Z answer the call to true feminism and authentic manhood. Timmerie holds a master's degree in biblical theology, and she covers this week's hottest stories from a Catholic worldview. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie.
It is great to be with you. We have a awesome show packed for you. We'll be talking about religious icons, religious imagery, its adoption to pop culture. Do you ever see someone who's maybe wearing a rosary around their neck or around their arm, or tattooed the Sacred Heart on their arm? Not anywhere else, hopefully. Anything like this. We're going to be talking about that pop culture, the tie into some of the gay culture right now that's very predominant. We'll be talking about the fact that the study has come out, yet another study confirming, and some researchers are saying this is the end of the gay gene theory. There is no gay gene. So listen up so we dive a little further into that, because apparently some people don't quite get where this study has turned out to be, and really help to clarify what is being taught in just the social sciences and where the church stands on it. Without further ado, Father Tim Grumbach is here in studio with me. He is the assistant parish priest at St. Augustine Parish, and he serves so many ministries, not only Trending, but Life Teen Young Catholic Professionals in Los Angeles. So you're in the area, please go check it out. You might see Father Tim Grumbach in person.
Yeah, I've been really looking forward to talking today about the way that beauty, truth, and goodness really break into our world through art, through icons, through the ways that we love. And so it's really always a joy to be here to talk about these things.
So I want to dive into that, because reality is that the church has always preserved the culture, the arts, the education. Right now, we're at this little bit of a kind of an odd point where the church is preserving it, but it's kind of holding on to it in the backdrop. We'll dive into kind of some stuff with various people, such as, I want to call her Miley Cyrus. I'm forgetting her name all of a sudden. Taylor Swift. Clearly, I don't listen to her very often, but just how this all really kind of falls in together. But someone was recently kind of complaining to me, saying, I don't always know what to think. I see religious art. I see it being adopted into the culture. And in one sense, I'm like, oh, that's really cool. You have the Sacred Heart tattooed to your arm. But on another, saying, you're not Catholic. I don't know how I feel about that. And, we see this with, attempts to make rosaries, but don't have the correct amount of beads. And they're wearing this jewelry. Your thoughts, Father Tim?
I've thought for a long time that the church was never meant merely to preserve the culture, preserve art and music. It was supposed to be at the forefront of it.
We're not there anymore.
Yeah, for so long it was the church that was, and the faith that was creating, and not just art and culture, but like philosophy as well. Mm-hmm. Was there was so long during the Middle Ages that if it was philosophy, it was because it was theology. And so the church was not merely meant to be, the language of late has been, don't let the church simply become a museum. Let it become something where, a place where these things are alive. And, I was thinking about this because we just celebrated our centennial mass at St. Augustine just a couple of weeks ago. So we're celebrating 100 years as a parish. We've been around longer than that, but as our own parish. We're named St. Augustine because we were a mission parish of St. Monica in Santa Monica, my home parish. And so it's really a joy to be here, for that 100th year. But they brought out, the fiddlebacks, the vestments that were worn for the extraordinary form of the Mass. It was the ordinary form of the Mass at the time. And the old missal with the Latin. And they put it up in the corner of our hall like it was like a little museum section. I'm like, I'll take those and I'll
wear them.
I'll wear them. I'll celebrate that Mass. Let's stop treating this stuff like museum pieces. But they were like dusting it off and like making it look real nice. I'm like, we're not meant to just preserve these things. We're meant to let them be at the forefront of a renewal and a restoration, and letting beauty break into the world. And not just liturgically at St. Augustine's, as we were talking about this just a little bit before, was that our parish is directly across the street from Sony Studios in Culver City in California. And there are these gigantic posters of movies and TV shows that are produced and created by Sony. And so every time I'm, driving back to the parish from, a sick call or something like that, I'm driving past these gigantic posters, and there are these 3 that are up there all together right now. And I think of it almost like a modern day cultural triptych, a triptych being, this 3-paneled image, almost almost like a comic strip of Revelation, where it's 3 images often up behind an altar telling a story, some story of the part of God's revelation of his love for humanity, his interaction with us. And it tells us who God is. Well, you have this triptych of gigantic movie posters right there on Washington Boulevard on Sony Studios across from St. Augustine Parish. And, on the right is a show called On Becoming a God in Central Florida. Kirsten Dunst is in it. And it's about kind of this pyramid scheme that she gets wrapped up in. And, I've only seen like the trailer for it. And it's all about getting this power and this success in this, relatively obscure part of the world, and kind of the violence she enters into to hold on to it. On the left side is a giant poster for this show called The Boys. I think it's on Amazon. And it's about these superheroes who have all these powers, and they're like commodifying these powers, and it's being run by the government, and because they have this special position in society, they can get away with whatever they want. They're gods walking on earth, and they're doing terrible things with their power. It's like the gods of Olympus, rapacious and destroying everything they touch. And then right in the middle is, honestly, growing up, one of my favorite comic books turned into a TV show. It's called Preacher. I realize now it's quite blasphemous. It's about
even the comic books.
Especially the comic books. These are some of the raunchiest comic books. Preacher and The Boys. I'm like, how did I take this stuff in when I was younger? Right. Long story very short. It's about a demon angel baby that possesses a preacher, and he can tell people what to do and make them do it with this new superpower. From this, demon angel baby that's possessed him. Anyways, it's a terribly blasphemous image of who God is. So ultimately, you have this 3-prong image of who God is for this culture, right up on Sony Studios, and they're telling us, God is selfish, he's stressed, he needs to get away, he needs to just do his own thing, and we can become God because God either doesn't exist or he doesn't care about us. That's the culture telling us who God is with their artwork. What have we done? We've given artwork over to the culture to say, tell us who God is. Tell us what beauty, truth, and goodness is, instead of letting our artwork as a church be done well and be done to show who God is, his care for us, that he exists, and what that beauty, truth, and goodness can break into this world. Well,
and I think about it, what does the word cult mean? Michael Knowles was just on the show a couple weeks ago, if you didn't catch it, and he was talking, a reminder that cult, we have to remember this. I remember learning it in theology class. Cult, ultimately, the word cult that comes into culture is worship. What do you worship? And so as we see that art has become increasingly secularized, or even mockery of the Catholic faith, or even a satanic element of it, we are not worshiping God. I think of Romans chapter 1 and how St. Paul talks about how when you turn your back on God, well, God, because of the freedom he's allowed us, gives us up. He allows us to, and all of a sudden we worship ourselves.
Yeah, and that really is one of the primary punishments of sinfulness. The Catechism tells us that we need to be careful when we see people suffering, that it's not always a direct result of their sin. Jesus looking at the blind man that he heals and said, well, it's not necessarily because of his sin or his parents' sin, but for that the glory of God may be revealed. But also that sometimes our sinfulness, the punishment for our sinfulness is to God lets us dive more deeply into that sinfulness, so that we grow a greater discontent in our hearts. And it's meant to throw us, into his breast. It's meant to draw us closer to him. That, as a father, he's not just arbitrarily beating us up because of the mistakes we've made or the choices that we've made. But sometimes he just allows us to, wallow in the filth of the pigs in order to grow a great discontent in our hearts, a restlessness.
But it's true, and I think that restlessness speaks so much to where we're at. For those, if you're just joining us, that's Father Tim Grumbach. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. And I think that restlessness and just like kind of the distraction that's happened and how modern day secular culture is defining the culture and defining what we worship, that whole question of, is it okay for, the Sacred Heart to be tattooed on a stranger who, isn't even, aware of Christianity, yet alone the devotion to the Sacred Heart? Or is it okay for someone to be wearing the rosary around their, neck like a form of jewelry? I think my take on it in many ways is, as long as that person, isn't using it in a sacrilegious, disrespectful way, I don't have a problem with the beauty of the imagery of the church being present. I know people who aren't Catholic who love Catholic things, Catholic saints. I mean, although I'm not a fan of St. Joseph at all being buried upside down in someone's yard to help sell a house, I do see that there's something in the culture turning in a way toward God. But I want to talk in a second, hear your thoughts there, because I want to come back to superstition as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, the way that Catholic art and culture is portrayed as beauty still in the culture is, you can look at a lot of TV shows, and when they want to portray something that's Catholic, they will often have this beautiful stained glass windowed church. They'll have a priest often in beautiful vestments. They'll often have Gregorian chant in the background, and they say, this is Catholic. And here we are, many Catholics being like, that's not the Catholicism I'm experiencing. They don't put these auditorium looking churches. They don't have a guitar rock band. They don't have rainbow stoles. The culture, maybe unwittingly, still looks at Catholicism to tell us what is beautiful and what is sacred and mysterious. They may still see it as some kind of evil, but they still see it as a mysteriousness that they can't quite tap into. And so when the wider culture wants to tap into Catholicism, you'll often get the Gregorian chant and the big, beautiful Gothic cathedral-style churches. And we're like, maybe we should be learning from them.
Well, and I think that's a beauty of the gateway into the church, that there's so much love and respect for the culture at times that sometimes it becomes adopted into a tattoo or whatever it might be. But also we can see it in the reverse, where when we adopt too much of the secular culture, we are pulled into it. I think about, we did a whole episode on yoga some time ago and Buddhism, but I know I have friends who started doing yoga just for the stretches. It became an everyday practice. And next thing you know, they are now living by Buddhism, and that is predominant in their life. And so I use that as an example. I'm not saying everyone who does yoga is necessarily susceptible, but when we adopt imagery, adopt culture, whether it's music, TV shows, we take on a lifestyle that often follows that, even if in some way.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The yoga conversation is a whole nother conversation. But what does that word even come from? I think it comes from the Sanskrit word for yoke. It's something that we would be yoking ourselves to these other spirits, these false gods. And the truth is, when Jesus says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light, any other yoke that we're going to put on ourselves is going to be heavier. And so if you think Jesus' yoke is heavy, go ahead and put your own yoke on and see what starts to happen. So we've been promised that, stay away from these yokes. Yeah. Put on Jesus's, and any suffering you might be going through, it's not yours. It's Jesus's, being lived out in you. So when we yoke ourselves to these other cultures, these other cultural expressions, these forms of artwork, and we just try to recreate it, like Jesusify it, I don't know, Christify it. For so long, over the last few decades, we've been doing it, and we've been doing it poorly. Yeah. We've been, just bringing pop music into the liturgy, and even though our bands may be doing a great job at it, it's still bad pop music. It's not the great soaring, majestic chant and polyphony that is still way more difficult to perform, if you want to use that word, to express, to enter into. And so we've given over the beauty of our Catholic culture to the culture outside, and say, we're just going to recreate what this culture is giving to us, and we don't even do it well.
Or sometimes we mistakenly, and I know we're getting off tangent a little bit, we mistakenly say, oh, well, anyone can be involved in this. But the reality is that some of us really do have gifts in certain ways, and we're called to give our gifts. We're not always just called to give our time. If you're not good at something, certain things maybe you shouldn't do. Well, yeah, I'm going to get in trouble here.
It's like, I know a lot of people who say, like, if God didn't give you a great voice, give it back to him. And it's just like dead to get people singing. And I'm thinking, well, maybe
sing from the pew, please.
Yeah. We've gotten so wrapped up in this thought we have to have everybody participating. Yeah. And we think, well, even if you have a bad voice, sing. We're like, no, it's okay. God dwells in unapproachable light and silence, and maybe He just wants you to be silent, and that has to be considered. Okay. Anyways, a little off tangent, but it needs to be said is that we try and force people into participation. People who don't sing well and maybe know it and don't want to sing, and we kind of say, well, you're not participating unless you're actively singing out. And I think that is the culture creeping into the church is that we've misunderstood what it means to participate in the sacrifice of the Mass.
We think
we have to be so active, and we've given over our responsibility of cultic worship of the Eucharist, where Christ is the high priest. We enter into his priesthood. The ministerial priest offers the sacrifice for the sake of the baptized priesthood, that we all have sacrifices to offer, and that's how we are meant to participate in the Mass. But we're just trying to get everybody up onto the altar and everybody up to the lectern, and we want people who, maybe that's not their gift, but we can't say no because everybody has to participate. And I think that's a symptom of letting too much of the culture in. There are tremendous gifts that have to be shared in the church, but we can't pretend that everybody has an active role to play by getting up into the sanctuary. No, everybody has an active role to play by uniting their sufferings and their joys to the cross of Christ, and so into the Eucharist.
Dear priest, I remember you used to always say when I was in college, you don't go to Mass. You don't have to go to Mass. You shouldn't say that. You shouldn't say, I have to go to Mass. You get to go to Mass. And you get to pray the Mass once you're there. And, as we're talking about music and various things, sometimes, I know people can get on kicks complaining about the liturgy, and I think that unfortunately, there have been a lot of abuses done to the liturgy that do not follow what the church teaches. But we have to remember, and I think there's a great power to so many people who, in the midst of liturgical abuses, are recognizing that I am there for the Eucharist. And Father John Therese, a wonderful priest, once said to me, we don't go to Mass to be consumers. We go to Mass to be consumed by our Lord.
Right. That comes right from St. Augustine, is with regular food, you consume it, it becomes you. But with the Eucharist, we receive it, we consume it, and we are consumed by it. We become it. So
that's Father Tim Grumbach. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. I want to talk on this religious art side of things, how sometimes at a certain point, we actually might be using it superstitiously. For example, I know I'm going to get mail about this one. Things like, taking St. Joseph and burying him upside down. You don't have to bury him upside down in order for you to sell your house. Now, the devotion to St. Joseph, having him present, great. He can be a great intercessor in helping you sell your house. But I heard something recently where a lot of places involved in the drug cartel, in fact, will set up these shops, and in fact they'll put patron saints such as like St. Michael, who's a patron for police officers, and in fact there's satanic worship connected to the drug cartel cult, and that there will be satanic altars in the back of these places, but they actually put St. Michael up because superstitiously, instead of kind of it being the patron of police officers, they're trying to ward off the police officers from coming in.
Right. It's they're taking our culture away from us, right? And because maybe we don't understand the culture to begin with, and this is the danger. It's a risk of having what's very important to the Catholic faith is this cultural piety, is pietistic experience of the faith, of these personal relationships with the saints, and it can be misunderstood as maybe cultures kind of clash and come into the Catholicism, and different religions find their way into the faith as well. And so you have these these little shops, botanicas they're called, right? And especially up in Los Angeles, we have a lot of that kind of experience, especially closer to downtown and with our Hispanic brothers and sisters. And there's a real danger of letting witchcraft find its way into the experience of the Catholic faith. And so it's more than just superstition, but it is, straight up the demonic finding its way. And it says so much about the demonic and about witchcraft is you cannot create anything by your own power. Satan is powerful, but not all powerful, and he cannot create. All he can do is counterfeit. And so this experience of the faith kind of being syncretized with this, with witchcraft, with Wicca, whatever you want to call it, is, it just shows the weakness of the power that's given to an individual through that, is that you cannot create anything on your own. You can only counterfeit it. And so they've taken these images of even, Our Lady of Guadalupe and St. Michael, and they've created certain things like, Santa Muerte and different folk saints, for the sake of these drug cartels and other and other things involved in witchcraft. It can't create; it can only counterfeit.
Well, and as we're talking about this, I look at a really interesting or I shouldn't even say stat, but estimate that came out. The gentleman, I don't know if we call him that, Lucian Graves, who runs the United States Satanic Temple, he estimated that 50% of their followers are actually identifying as gay. Again, I'll repeat that again. 50% of the Satanic Temple's followers are estimated to be gay, and they start talking about the Black Mass and other things. Well, it's all counterfeit. As Father Tim, you're saying, they celebrate their, quote, Black Mass. What is it? It's a desecration of the Eucharist. They have to go and steal the Eucharist from Mass in order to do this.
It's a desecration of the human person as well,
right.
Because, I've never been around one. I've never even studied the Black Mass, but what I've heard about it is that they even use a naked woman as the altar. And, what is more of a, desecration of the human person than to desecrate the Eucharist on a human person? Especially taking advantage of their sexuality in that way. So, a Black Mass, this experience of Satanism. And there's something else that he says about Satanism is that the members don't actually need to believe in a personal Satan, that Satan exists as a person. We've heard about that somewhere else similarly recently, haven't we? A rather high-ranking priest in a religious order in the Catholic Church recently, seems to have said something along the lines of, Satan exists as a personification of evil within systems, within political systems,
but isn't a real person.
But is not a personal reality like us. And in a sense, no, the angels and the demons are not personal realities in the same way that we are.
They're not human persons. They're angels.
They're not human persons. They're angels. They are personals. They are spiritual persons. And it's really terrifying to think that came from a superior of a religious order as powerful as that one. But it's eerily similar to what the Satanists are saying.
Well, and this is, maybe you're finding yourself here, and this is slightly off topic, but I think ties in. Unfortunately, we talked about liturgical abuses earlier, and it's not here we're trying to complain. We're just acknowledging the reality is that we're not always getting the truth. I just talked to someone who grew up Catholic, fell away, 25 years old, goes back to church, and contacts one of their parents saying, I feel like I have been gypped my entire life. Like they go to a mass with some of, the smells, the bells, with solid catechesis and the homilies, with profound reverence. And all of a sudden they went to a Latin mass and they said, I missed out my entire life. Like, why didn't I have this? And I'm not saying everyone needs to go to a Latin mass, but that's one gentleman's experience, that there's this craving for truth. And yet the Satanism is portraying and saying Satan isn't real. We don't even believe in Satan. It's just a rationalism, which is ultimately pride. And I look at it, and we have pride, money, and lust at the heart of this worship. And it's so fascinating to me, because what do they stand by? Well, they said there are three basic things we as Satanists stand by. Do all that you wish. And 2, no one has the right to command you. And 3, you are the God of yourself. Those principles go against humility. They go against truth. They go against goodness. It's me, myself, and I, and that is it. And
they'll tell you that there is absolutely nothing wrong with you. This is the counterfeit of God's mercy. This is an attempt at mercy without justice. And ultimately, it will turn into a justice without mercy. It's the wonderful saying that Satan will tempt you by saying, "Oh, don't worry, think about God's mercy." And then after one has sinned by listening to that and committing their own act by choice, Satan will again come to them with a voice and say, "What have you done? You are awful. You are defined by this sin." And God will, think of God's justice. Only think of God's justice. And so to say that, you are a law unto yourself, that no one has the right to judge you, that you are God to yourself, this is a counterfeit of God's mercy and that sense of there's nothing wrong with you. When we can take up the words of G.K. Chesterton, who says, "Look at the world. Original sin is the only sin we have empirical proof of." There is something very broken in the world, and they have no way to explain what's broken in the world if there's nothing wrong with us, if there's no call to conversion, if there's, even the one who's at the heart of, their so-called religion, doesn't even exist as an actual person. When we look at our God and we say, not only is he not less than a person, he's more than a person, he's infinitely more than a person, but he cannot be less. Our God is a person, he's alive, and he's real. And we believe that your so-called founder of your religion, your Satan, we believe in him more than you do.
We have to be careful not to be tempted by rationalism and make it our God. I look at the chief exorcist for the Vatican came out talking about some of these things, and we'll get into that in a little bit, but we talked about some notes from an exorcist a couple months ago. Father Tim was talking about the greatest thing threatening us is this tendency toward temptation, that we're not avoiding the near occasion of sin. Well, what pulls us away from that temptation? We're going to talk about that a little bit. We'll be right back with Father Tim Grumbach.
Timmerie will be right back. Send her a tweet at Timmerie. That's TIMMERIE. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, where morality and culture meet, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics.
That's Father Tim Grumbach. I'm Timmerie. We're your hosts. I want to talk briefly. We ended just the last segment talking about how to avoid temptation, about how exorcists have talked about how the greatest thing to really protect us against the demonic is avoiding temptation, that's the way that they continue to kind of beat their way in. Well, what avoids the demonic? We read that as Jesus is up on Mount Tabor at the Transfiguration, he comes down, the apostles are having a difficult time casting out a demon, and they're going, why couldn't we do this? And he says, some demons can only be cast out with not just prayer, but also fasting.
Right.
And so I propose to you not only to dive deeper into the sacraments, but to understand and start to find ways in a small way so that we can get to a bigger way of fasting in our life, prayerful fasting.
Right. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus doesn't say if you pray, if you fast, if you give alms. He says when you pray, when you fast, when you give alms. There's an expectation that this is a part of a Christian life.
Yeah, it's fundamental to who we are. And I think that it ties in a sense, to this story. Some of you may have followed over the last month or so. There's been this breaking story of a gentleman who identifies as gay, who threw himself a party, received a blessing from a priest, and somehow got approval supposedly for a Catholic funeral, and that he claims that a priest signed off on all of this, yet he then went ahead and committed suicide through physician-assisted suicide with a lethal dose of drugs. That way of ending your life goes completely against what the Catholic Church teaches, but in this big publicity stunt that he seemed to really set up in many ways, it's creating a great scandal for many people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as the article we're looking at says, Bob Fuller lived out loud. That this was a man that didn't keep secrets about what his plans were, and so being in a relatively large parish here in Los Angeles, I don't know everything that's happening in the life of every parishioner. Part of me wishes I did, just so that I could be there for them at all, as much as possible. But this was not a man who kept his life hidden, and so it's hard for me to imagine that this parish in Washington was unaware of his plans. And so it sounds like they were very much aware of his plans as a parish. Unfortunately for this priest who was pictured given this blessing to Mr. Fuller. At his last mass at the parish before he, committed suicide, was caught up in all of this. And it's really, it's hard to really understand clearly his role in it, but it seems that he was just a visiting priest. He's a grad student, and
he wasn't aware of the details.
Wasn't aware of the details, and he claims that he was there visiting to do mass, and they told him that this was going to be his last mass. So we just figured, this is a very sick man, and what I would do in that circumstance is, of course, we need to pray with this man. I don't know if I would make it a part of the liturgical blessing. I'd be a little bit confused if there were photographers there, as there were. But as far as I can tell, reading the interview with Father Dupont, the Jesuit priest who was a part of that, he was caught up in a very unfortunate situation. But almost all the rest of the details about Mr. Fuller's life leading up to this, it's a really difficult situation, and the parish may have to answer for this, in the sense that they are known as a parish who very, very much supported him. And some of the details about the way that he lived in the parish
are unacceptable.
Yeah, right. Even the small detail, I find it cute, but I would hear it like nails on a chalkboard was apparently, as a lector,
oh gosh, it's not cute.
He would Mad Lib during the readings and just kind of add his own little comments in the middle of the readings of, well, sacred scripture.
Yeah, so he'd lecture for the church. And this is where I have to say it's a cause for scandal. This man obviously lived out a lifestyle that contradicted the church. And so it gets into that debate. All are welcome, but you're not necessarily, should you be welcome to serve as a leader within the church? And that's where now, for this publicity stunt and all the news that this story is getting, there's some real concern, and he's proud of the fact that he ad-libbed during the readings at Mass. I mean, the whole story is quite tragic, that he would then get to the point where he chose to end his own life. My question is, what was the parish actually doing to help him with the things he was struggling with, rather than just approving what he was living in? Yeah,
we were just talking earlier about the sense of the demonic, the diabolic, the satanic inability to create, but only to counterfeit. And I cannot exactly claim that the demonic had something to do with this, but what I'm seeing here is this kind of a disobedience takes the shape of counterfeit, taking something beautiful about the liturgy and making it one's own, of looking at the church's teaching and not really seeking an obedience in it, but there's still something that we have to we have to say about this is a man who went through great suffering because of his illnesses, and how unfortunate it was that the parish could not support him in obedience to the church's way of supporting those who are dying through these the spiritual and corporal acts of mercy, but rather seem to accommodate rather than invite him into a conversion.
And I think that this is a reminder for all of us. We have to remember that is what the church is calling all of us. I look at, when we're praying the rosary, we're praying, the proclamation of the kingdom. Well, what did Jesus proclaim? The kingdom of God is at hand, but he's calling everyone to conversion, to this deep repentance, and that he will be there through all of it. And how has the church showed this man, Robert Fuller, who ultimately committed an act that was so despairing in that suicide? How was he told that God is with him where he's at? Instead, he found that his soul, the words in his testimony kind of say that his soul was suffering. And so he decided to end it the way his grandmother did, who had also apparently committed suicide. But I look back, Father Tim, even at more details from Robert Fuller's story, he saw a number of his friends in the gay community who had died as a result of HIV. And this is the sad reality of someone who has seen a tremendous amount of death around him. And this is the reality that people don't want to talk about when we're discussing the whole issue surrounding same-sex attraction and really same-sex activity that's problematic, because you always have a freedom to choose. And then it says that in 1985, after seeing many friends die, that he became HIV positive, and that it was only because of a drug that was able to save him for a number of years. But it was when he was 70, he suddenly contracted a throat cancer. I just wonder at where even HPV might be tied in there with the throat cancer, because we know HPV can be contracted through oral engagement. Right. And there's so much in this gentleman's story that we see the deterioration when we turn away from God and become our own idol and let pride enter in. There's a real problem with where we live our faith. And we as a church have a responsibility to reach out to the people who are struggling. Right, and making that very important distinction between the evil of the act and the dignity of the human person. Right. And where a lot of this plays in right now is, what was the church's role and even the bishop's role in allowing for a Catholic funeral? That was one of the strangest notes of this whole story, was that he'd planned his own funeral, a week in advance or so before he died. And that the pastor okayed this, and even the bishop, had some very pastoral words to say about that, saying, yes, we have some, pastoral care that we're responsible for family and for friends, and yet it's important to look. And I know the bishop was very much aware of canon law, and so I can't pretend to correct him on this by any means. But they definitely leaned in a more pastoral direction rather than the concern of scandal by this becoming such a public story and then allowing for a Catholic funeral. Just a quick note of what canon law has to say about funerals is that every Catholic has a right to the rites of a funeral, but that there are a number of exceptions for those for whom a funeral should not be given, because in our culture, we may think that a funeral is just for the family.
That is an atheistic view of understanding death and our relation to the communion of saints and our understanding of purgatory, heaven and hell, of these last things and the final judgment, is to think that a funeral is just for the family, as if that person still has no connection to us, or not somehow even more connected to us through their death, through the death of Christ in which they have entered as a baptized Catholic. So it says, very clearly, although there are a lot of pastoral exceptions, that church funeral rites are to be denied for the following, unless they'd given some expression of repentance before their death, is notorious apostates, heretics, schismatics. Language that may not be used as much as it has before. Those who've had their bodies cremated in order to try to disprove God's ability for the resurrection. Again, probably not the case here. But then other manifest sinners for whom a church funeral would cause scandal. And that could be argued that this is very much the case. And so if there's any doubt about this, the local ordinary is to be consulted. That would be the bishop. He was consulted. He seems to have allowed the funeral to happen. But I think it comes down to, has this caused scandal? I think it has. And maybe that's just because of, they didn't expect this story to go so public, and the ability for social media to make all of this known. It's become a bit of a scandal. And so the question should be, should you allow a funeral for someone who causes such scandal in the church?
Well, and even if the story hadn't gone public, the scandal it's causing for the parish and the parishioners, and how this goes on. And even if he did manipulate, let's say in some way, the priest to sign off on the funeral and all these different elements, maybe all the information wasn't there, his intentions were made clear with social media posts some months prior, calling into really account the fact that the priest had been approving this. And this is where all of us have to convict our own hearts. Here's a story. It has clearly caused scandal for many individuals, but this is what sin does. And how can we fight to make sure that we are not causing scandal by our own bad example when we too sin, or maybe talk about sin as so blasé that it creates a false sense of approval within the church?
Right. And a lot of people will point to, well, Jesus spent time with the people who were most scandalous. Yes. But he called them out of that scandal. And, there are a few stories of the apostles acting a little bit out of control. Peter eating with the Gentiles and then running away to eat with the Jews, and Paul having to confront him on that.
He rebukes him.
Right. But to simply say, oh, Jesus loved to spend time with the scandalous. Yeah, well, he called them out of that.
And what was he doing with them? He was having a meal. There's a difference between participating in their act and having a meal.
Absolutely.
You can listen to more of Trending via the podcast on iTunes or the iHeartRadio app, where you can share your favorite episodes. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie.
Father Tim Grumbach is in the studio with me, and we have been talking about this tie-in of religious art, about the adoption of pop culture. And now really all of this theme comes together in one respect. And I want to bring to light kind of just one part of the conversation. We've been talking a lot about how culture influences us and what we worship in many ways. But in fact, the chief exorcist for the Vatican came out recently talking about, in his book, how satanic influence can really lead to confusion about one's own self and, in fact, one's own gender. And he actually noted particularly for the young and how this tie-in with the demonic and the satanic present with regard to same-sex attraction or just identity confusion and disorder that people are experiencing. I think this is relevant because it's one thing to have confusion, but it's another thing to be tempted to the point of acting on certain sexual behaviors. And when we talk about same-sex attraction, the church has been very, very clear that it's the act that's disordered, not the person. It's this false idea of an identity that can become disordered, not the person. Same-sex attraction is something someone experiences, but the action is something that someone acts upon. It's a reminder the church says we're free. We're free even in the midst of the greatest temptation. We are free, even if the consequences might be death. And that was the consequence for Christ. He died because he stood for truth and freedom.
And the philosophy, the anthropology, that is the understanding of the human person that the church gives to us, is so beautiful. And it goes so much deeper than the surface anthropology that the culture wants to throw at us, to understand our identity only by our attractions, especially our sexual attractions. And the church has been very clear over the last few decades, especially as the culture begins to rise, the LGBT culture continues to rise, that to simply identify ourselves by sexual attractions does a great disservice to who we are, our identity as sons and daughters of God.
And that's why in the language of the church, Father Tim and I have talked a lot about this. We talk about people who experience same-sex attraction. We never refer to someone as being gay. And here's why. Because in the teaching of the Catholic Church, it's also always looked at, we're not going to get into the debate of, as the church, we're not going to get into the debate of the cause of someone's same-sex attraction. As the church, the church takes a moral stance on whether or not a same-sex attracted act is moral or immoral. Mm-hmm. So it recognizes there's a distinction between action and person. A person is good, and action can either be good or bad. And what's incredible is that the church has stood by this in its just incredible teaching all these years. Yet at the same time, a study came out right now looking at, well, is there a gay gene? Well, is there a gay gene? Even if there was or was not, the human person is still free, is what the church has always stood by. Well, this study that came out in the Journal of Science by the American Association for the Advancements of Science came out, and people are saying, leading people working in the industry of medicine, in the industry of molecular medicine, are saying that this is the end of the debate over the gay gene. There is no gay gene. Mm-hmm.
And so the question was always going to be about the nature or the nurture. How is somebody raised? Is this something that's built into them? And it'll be very interesting to see how some of the voices that claim to speak for the church, that claim to speak with scriptural authority, who have been saying that you are identified by your sexual attractions, that you were born this way, that you were made this way. It'll be interesting to see how they cope with this, they react to this, if they will find some kind of mental and linguistic gymnastics to find their way around what seems to be a rather conclusive study that there is no gay gene, that this is not something that that was built into you, this is not the way that you were made, but that ultimately, yes, it does come down to the freedom that we are called. There are certain instincts built into us that would be very dangerous for us to act out on at all times. And right. So, even our nature has to be perfected by the supernatural.
Right. And as a result of the fall, as a result of our original sin, we have a tendency towards sin. It's called concupiscence. I mean, this is one of those ones where the church is so great. It's thought of and it has acknowledged everything.
No one knows the human person. Yeah, no one knows the human person like the church does. And the individuals in the church haven't always acted on that. But understand, for the 2,000 years since Christ walked the earth, having been guided by the Holy Spirit, but also the wealth of wisdom that comes from the Jewish tradition and our inheritance, really, is we understand the human person better than any other organization or institution possibly could, because we've been enlightened by the one who made us. And so, as we've mentioned before, that so much of culture and art was not only preserved, but was put forth by the church. Same thing with so much of the psychology of the human person and understanding the anthropology, the understanding of the human person in the light of who God is. So, right, a theology of the body. We understand sexuality. We understand humanity, psychology better than anyone else possibly could in this world, because of our experience of knowing not only the worst parts of humanity, but knowing what humanity is most capable of, being drawn up into the summation of all things in Christ Jesus.
That's Father Tim Grumbach. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. The human person is created for good, and that's what's so important to remember. And I want to touch a little bit just on some of the background of this study. So in the past, studies that have gotten into the gay gene theory have been small. They've been small sample groups, a couple hundred people here and there. And when someone tries to come out and say that, there's a gay gene, and this hasn't happened for a long time, they end up coming out years later saying, I never proved it never existed. And so it's interesting, because when the LGBTQ community tries to stand and, there's a gay gene, you're born gay, the people that they try to stand on the backs of actually denied it, and in some ways completely changed their conversation. Mm-hmm. Now, this study is different from any other because it actually was a multi-country study, really looking at over 500,000 individuals. And in that study, it really came to the conclusion, as the lead author, Andrea Gana, who's is actually from Finland. Is from Finland. She's with the Institute of Molecular Medicine, and she said, from a genetic standpoint, there is no single genetic distinction from opposite sex to same-sex behavior. Now, it's interesting because some who are in favor of same-sex attraction are trying to take this one minuscule data point from the study. Unfortunately, we have obviously a dissenting priest, Father James Martin, who wants to get into the gay gene theory rather than teaching what the church teaches and not wanting to get into the whole background of whether or not someone is born gay per se. But this data point that he stands on, there's less than 1% differences and some of this 500,000 people that shows that there's this different score that some of them experience and that they have in common. But again, it's less than 1%. It's a 5% data point, and it actually is only associated with someone who has had one type of sexual encounter with someone of the same sex. It's not people who are living gay lifestyles. And so even all of the authors come together. These are small data points that have less than 1%, but it has nothing to do with the gay gene or born this way type of theory, even making it possible.
Yeah, and that that dissenting voice continues to try to point out you were made this way, you are identified by this in a sense, and that's unfortunate because the more he speaks that way, as much as his intention seems to be to include people, bring people into the church, and make sure that this is a welcoming and a place where people can find a home. The more and more he speaks that way, the more and more he seems to be drawing away from solid Catholic teaching, especially of the Catechism. Yeah. And it's a frightening thing that it's being brought more and more into the light. These certain things would not have been said 5-10 years ago, but now there's more and more boldness to step one little step further away from church teaching, but always to hide behind the shield of, I don't dissent from church teaching. I affirm what is said in the Catechism, what the church teaches, but to support that minuscule part of this study for the sake of the dissenting voice's own interpretation.
Well, it's fascinating. It's the only thing that he stands on. He doesn't address any of the rest of the study. And the fact that geneticists all over are saying, no, this ends the debate. And in fact, it's interesting because people who get really high into this and molecular microbiology and all the elements, they want to talk about gene editing that is becoming so scary and so prominent. And what this confirms yet again is that there's no possibility of gene editing to make someone gay or straight. It's impossible. Because there's no gay gene. And so from a gene editing perspective, this is where the science is really helpful for affirming the entire conversation.
Right. And what a frightening thing that that side of the argument would want to go to gene editing to prove that there's a natural element to this. It would be like saying, look at the power we have to clone human beings. Right. That proves a certain thing about our nature. To act as God in order to prove God. I don't know if that's a proper way to go about this study.
Well, and that's interesting because that's kind of where sometimes the studies have been helpful when you look at twin studies. And if two people are biological twins and one is same-sex attract and one not, that's been part of the proof in the past that there is no gay gene because they would both have to be gay in that instance.
Yeah. And so we continue to hear the dissenting voice. It continues to get louder, but
you know better.
We trust in obedience, the church's teaching, which is, again, the church understands the human person because of understanding the depth of the sorrows of sin, but also the promises of redemption and seeing it lived out day in and day out. To have this new voice, this new attempt to redefine the human person in our own image rather than the image of God, it's a frightening thing. But we have promises that the church cannot err, that the gates of the netherworld will not prevail, that the Holy Spirit is with us to protect us, and we continue to entrust ourselves to that.
And we remember the reality of freedom and the reality of God's grace working in our lives to help us overcome whatever we might have experienced. It's been a great hour. Thank you for being with us. You can follow Father Tim Grumbach at Father Tim Grumbach on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And you can find me at radiotrending.com.
This has been Trending with Timmerie. To book her to speak or learn more about her guests, visit radiotrending.com. You can listen to more of Trending via the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or the iHeartRadio app, where you can share your favorite episodes.